1, 2, 3.
While our weekly shows are edited to time for broadcast on public TV and community radio, we offer to our members and podcast subscribers the full Uncut conversation. The following is from our episode featuring Masha Gessen, opinion columnist for the New York Times and author of Surviving Autocracy, as well as a distinguished professor at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at the City University of New York. And also, Gessen Stanley, author of Erasing History and How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. He's a professor at the Monk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. These audio exclusives are made possible thanks to our member supporters.
We're faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We're confronted with the fierce urgency of now. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residue of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, "too late." Those are the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., speaking against a war that he believed would lead to catastrophe both for civil rights and humanity at large. Today, we're going to consider that question of urgency, but in relation to the promise of U.S. democracy and its loss. Is fascism close or still far off? How about authoritarianism? Is it here? When, as he did on the 27th of March, the president issued an executive order called Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History that singled out for correction a Smithsonian exhibition promoting the view that race is not a biological reality, are we entering fascist territory? How about when masked men abduct teachers and students apparently for their views? Or when the White House asserts that some people do not deserve trials? To help us think about this moment, we have invited two experts whose families have escaped totalitarian regimes before and who are sounding alarm bells here now. Masha Gessen is an acclaimed Russian-American journalist, a Polk Award-winning opinion writer for the New York Times, and the author of Surviving Autocracy, as well as The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia, which won a National Book Award. Forced to leave Russia twice, in 2024, a Moscow court convicted Masha in absentia to 8 years in prison for their reporting on the war in Ukraine. Gessen Stanley is a best-selling author and professor whose books include Erasing History, How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future, and How Fascism Works. He's a child of Jewish refugees who fled Nazi Germany and has recently left his teaching position at Yale University to relocate to Canada with his family. He will be joining the University of Toronto's Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy this fall. I am very glad to welcome you both, Masha Gessen, Gessen Stanley, to Laura Flanders and Friends. I believe this is the first time you've spoken together. Is that true?
I think so. Anywhere.
Well, it's my treat. Let's start, as I sometimes do when I feel the conversation is particularly both urgent and heavy, with just sort of centering ourselves in this place where each of us is right now. Who is uppermost in your mind, on your heart, as we begin to speak? Masha.
We're all worrying me, but most of all, obviously, people who are in ICE detention, some of whose names we know, and some of whose names we don't know. And I'm using ICE detention broadly to include the maximum security prison in El Salvador, where several hundred people have been transported.
What about you, Gessen? Who's uppermost in your mind as we start to talk?
Well, I'm concerned that Masha and I will overlap too much, but I think both ICE detention, those who are being snatched off the streets, those who are now in ICE detention, as well as those who have long languished in American prisons and jails, suffering under a long-standing racist police state.
Moving to the moment, thank you for that. Moving into our conversation, one of the reasons we wanted to speak with you both is not only do you think deeply and analyze what we're looking at politically, but you and your families have lived through it. And I guess one of our first questions is, what's the history that you bring to this moment, and how does that affect your understanding of what's going on? Gessen.
Well, my mother was a court stenographer in Manhattan criminal court for 33 years. And she was 8 years old when she came to the United States. She from Poland in 1948. She grew up in a Siberian in the Gulag as one of the Polish Jews that Stalin took to to Siberia, and was repatriated back to Poland in 1945 and underwent all this anti-Semitic abuse that Jan Grosz writes about in his book Fear. And then she came to the United States and she recognized essentially the American racist police state as a court stenographer, and always drew my attention to that. She always drew my attention to the dangers that these forces of racial hierarchy, though she wouldn't have put it in that way. She thought that racial hierarchy, that scapegoating was a natural part of any human society, and drew attention to the fact that it wasn't us here and we should be lucky. But my kids are Black, and so that fear of the United States, while at the one, both my parents, my father came in 1939 at age 7 from Berlin, and both my parents grew up in fear, and my mother communicated that fear about the United States with respect to its racial hierarchies. And now, sort of, if you think about fascism as when they do to white people what they've always done to Black people, that family history together with that theoretical understanding brings me to my sort of understanding of the current moment.
And how about you, Masha? How does your history inform your observations today?
Well, Jason and I do overlap in our origin stories. My grandmother was one of those Jews who who were taken from Poland to Siberia, which is how she survived. But my grandmothers, who were also best friends long before my parents met, were two women who both survived totalitarian regimes and thought deeply about the price of that survival. And so my first book was actually called Esther and Ruzia, How My Grandmothers Survived Hitler's War and Stalin's Peace. And that book was published more than 20 years ago, but I've been thinking about that question longer than that.
So this question of flight has come up recently, specifically in your case, Jason, where you got a lot of grief for once it got announced that you were going to be leaving the United States for Canada, for Toronto, and taking up a position there in the fall. How have you responded to your critics on that? And I've heard from some people, well, if the fascism expert's going, should we all flee?
Yeah, no, we shouldn't all flee. I mean, I had an offer at the University of Toronto, and academia is a kind of partly meritocratic thing where, the University of Toronto stands to benefit from the crushing of US universities. So plenty of academics are going to go to find other opportunities. That's just how academia works. And my friends Tim Snyder and Marcy Shore are already there. Tim and I have taught for years together. So in particular, Tim, Marcy, sort of, I bring the American angle to their Eastern European angle. So, we have big plans for the University of Toronto. It's also a time to, my students were challenging me about this today in my course on fascism and patriarchy, it's a sort of, there's a social meaning of certain actions. And it occurred to me that there'd be a social meaning of Jewish intellectuals leaving. That was an important social meaning to send, even though other things I could have done would have sent other important social meanings. But when the intellectuals leave, that has an important social meaning. Unfortunately, now I have to leave.
Masha, your thoughts?
Well, I've left a few too many times in my life, so I'm going to stay put for as long as it's safe. But I'm not at all convinced that it's going to be safe for a long time. I'm a naturalized citizen. I've been quite outspoken against this administration and against its friend, the Putin administration, which has a warrant out for me, and I'm trans. So I kind of check all the boxes. I'm not a big fan of leaving my built-in bookshelves. So and I have 3 kids in this country. But look, the fact that we're talking about it seriously less than 100 days into this administration is shocking.
Maybe it wasn't soon
That
enough,
was
though. I mean, one of the issues raised by all of your work is that we needed to be talking about this much sooner. Not about leaving per se, but about what was happening in this country in front of our eyes. And I was very struck by Maria Ressa, the Filipino journalist and Nobel Prize winner, who talked about the speed with which the Duterte regime was able to destroy Philippine democracy. And I guess I wonder how each of you is recognizing this moment. Where on the clock of fascism are we at this time, Masha?
So speed is an important concept, and as is democracy. So let's try to unpack this, right? Because I think that I have very little tolerance for the wailing about our American democracy that is being destroyed. But what I would propose is that democracy is never a state of being. Democracy is a vector of development. And this country has been on a roller coaster for the last 24 years at least. This is a flawed story. We can tell this story with other starting points, but I think that starting at 9/11 is useful. Right? And the periods when we were on a vector of expanding democracy, and by that I mean enfranchising more people, right? More where the government of the governed represents more of the governed. We've been on a democratic vector for less of this 24-year period than on an anti-democratic vector. At the same time, we're not living through more terrible Republican policies. We're living through a catastrophic acceleration. Right? And the difference, I think, between what this country has experienced before and what we're experiencing now is that it is very likely irreversible. If it's not past the point of no return now, it's getting very close to the point of no return.
Jason?
Yeah, so Masha is exactly right that democracy is, as political philosophers would say, it's a practice. It's an ideal, as Dewey said, it's an ideal. And you know you're in a democracy when you at least take yourself to be engaged in the project of realizing that ideal. But it's never a finished ideal. There's never been a pure democracy before. But there are certain societies that have democratic ideals that where the project is, where it's a criticism of someone to say, you're anti-democratic. And there are other countries that do not have democratic ideals, where it's just you're not in the business of trying to realize the two democratic ideals of freedom and equality. So my love of the United States is a love of the United States as a democratic project, as a project of moving towards these ideals of freedom and equality. That's why Frederick Douglass, and there's a long sort of started basically a tradition of appealing to those democratic ideals to point out hypocrisy. But when you're not following those democratic ideals anymore, when they're not the center of your self-identity, then you can't appeal to those ideals to criticize authoritarianism. And what I see now is this regime shifting the self-understanding of America from having these democratic ideals, however imperfectly, and God knows, they've been imperfect, to self-identity as loving the United States because we have these great men in our past, and we've conquered the West, and we can punch you in the nose. And that's not a democratic project. That's like what Putin is doing.
Well,
in
I mean,
Russia.
that goes back to that executive order I mentioned at the top about the Smithsonian. The other part of that order is instituting the idea that everything in that museum needs to tell American history as a story of constant progress, which, of course, as you've both said, is not true. Going back the centuries of this country's existence, there's been forward movement and back. Now, Masha, you just said we are in a potentially irreversible moment. Can you elaborate on that?
So I find very useful the model that was worked out by a Hungarian political scientist named Balint Magyar. And he divides autocratic transformation into three stages: autocratic attempt, autocratic breakthrough, and autocratic consolidation. And the difference between an autocratic attempt, or rather, an autocratic breakthrough happens when it is no longer possible to reverse the autocratic attempt through electoral means. So that's what I think we're living through. And among the many executive orders that are very important, I would, of course, mention the executive order on elections, which is terrifying, and which really lays out a framework for excluding the maximum possible number of people from participating in elections. And that's just one aspect of making elections meaningless. There's also pressure on the media. There's also just the evisceration of the party system as we have known it. But all of these things, in addition to the way that Trump is just usurping executive power, makes me think that we're very close to the point where existing electoral means will be insufficient to reverse what Trump is doing.
Many people have made the point that we are dealing with some new phenomena here as well. And I want to just play for people a clip of the Guardian reporter Carol Cadwalader's recent TED Talk, where she talked about the role of AI and specifically compared the capacity of AI today to do what the old file-keeping spies of the East German Stasi, the secret police, did in terms of record-keeping on the citizens. Here's Carol.
The first thing that Elon Musk did was to send his cyber troops into the US Treasury to get access to the data. That is not a coincidence, it's a hack. That data is now feeding AIs that are choosing who to sack and who to replace. Eliminate fraud and waste. When we broke the Cambridge Analytica story about the harvesting 87 million people's Facebook data, people freaked out, rightly. This is chicken feed compared to that. But it is the blueprint. It's always the data. Which is why it's so important that you start thinking about your private life. The oligarchy doesn't want you to have one. This is the old headquarters of the East German secret police. They kept detailed files on almost 1 in 3 of their citizens. That is nothing compared to what Google has on every single one of us and hundreds of other companies. The entire business model of Silicon Valley is surveillance. It harvests our data in order to sell us stuff. We are already living inside the architecture of totalitarianism. It may not have been deliberate, but we now have to start acting as if we live in East Germany and Instagram is the Stasi.
So she says there at the end that we should think about our private lives. That the broligarchy, as she calls them, don't want us to have them. And that Instagram is the new Stasi. Don't want to force you into a debate with Carol Cadwalader, Masha, but in terms of the role that new technologies are playing, does that mean that we are in a fundamentally different place than we perhaps have been before?
I honestly don't know. I think that historical references are actually sufficient for understanding what we're going through now. It's obviously amplified by technology, and technology adds tools to the toolbox, but I'm not convinced that technology in itself is changing the nature of the beast.
What about you, Jason?
Yeah, I mean, my job in like propaganda conferences in 2017, 2018, before they became technocratic, was to make the point Masha just made, that, the television was once supposed to have, and the radio was, I mean, look at Trump. He's a creature of television, right? So these were old technologies. I would put, however, the effect of new technologies as a teacher, I see this on the radicalization of young men. Uh, I think, the algorithmic nature of YouTube, et cetera, is having a radicalizing effect. It's made far right, it's made reactionary modernism cool. It's made the patriarchal machismo cool in a way that I didn't expect, because I think, like, I see my kids, they're the anti-woke humor is something that resonates with them. And I think for too long, we rested on our laurels thinking, we on the left rested on our laurels thinking we would kind of own the cultural space of the youth. And I think the new media has had an effect on that assumption.
So you're both nodding here. I would wonder what you think is the role of the media in particularly stirring up the transphobia that we saw weaponized to such great effect in the last election, Masha. And a question for you as to whether transitioning has brought you new insights into fascism as a phenomenon.
Well, transphobia seems to have been whipped up by entirely conventional media means: television advertising, newspaper articles, a lot of meddling with local politics, and smart sort of weaponizing of people's fears, where I think new media are particularly important is actually maybe a little bit unexpected. It's that the eternal fear of parents that they will not know their children, that they will not speak the same language as their children, is amplified not by the media itself, but by the existence of media that young people consume and parents don't consume. And that's what really, I think, is operative in the transphobia, right? It's that fear that Trump is so good at verbalizing, that your child will go to school and come back as someone else. And the fear of not knowing your children is, I think, Jason, we both experience it, right? It's because they're like looking at the thing, and even if you look at the thing that they're looking at, you can't understand what they're seeing. And that is kind of terrifying, but it has nothing to do with trans people. And as most things that are related to transphobia have nothing to do with trans people. So I don't know. I mean, I've somehow in my life have found many ways to be queer and Jewish and trans, which are all sort of interchangeable categories in modern fascism. So I don't know that I've gained any new insights.
So what about fighting back? I mean, one of the things that we're sort of dancing around here is like where we're at. And sometimes I wonder, well, maybe this conversation isn't as helpful as what do we need to do in this moment? I think that also about the discussion about, is this authoritarianism or is this fascism? Correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe you think that is an important distinction to draw. And maybe I should start with that. Is that an important distinction to draw? Masha? Oh, Jason.
Laura, I wanted to add more about the vital nature of understanding the attack on trans people in this
Sure.
moment. Would that be okay? Because rigid gender roles, the biological essentializing that you talked about earlier, is essential to the fascist mindset. I mean, Hannah Arendt talks about the genocidal impact of nationalist ideology coming in when it became biological, when race became biological. And Andrea Dworkin talks about how the link between the biological, the kind of feminism that bases itself on biology is the most dangerous idea in humankind. And what we see, another executive order we should discuss, is the Trump regime's executive order saying that there are immutable biological natures. And this administration believes that gender arises from immutable biological natures, which, as you said about the Smithsonian exhibition on race, it echoes that. And we really need to think deeply and philosophically about this kind of essentializing of biology and why it comes with authoritarianism. It's utterly incoherent, right? Because I wear glasses. That's fixing my biology. If you say that biology is immutable, you can't really take anti-anxiety medications anymore. So it's an incoherent idea, but it's somehow central to the structure.
Well, it's a coherent idea if you're trying to assert that there are rigid hierarchies.
Right.
Masha?
And if I can add even a little anecdote. So I grew up in a country where everybody's ethnicity was an immutable part of their identity. And every single personal document indicated that I was Jewish, which in the Soviet Union was an ethnicity, not a religion. So from my birth certificate to my school records, to my medical records, to if I filed a police report, it would have my ethnicity on it. And then in the 90s, Russia passed a law that a person had the right to self-identify. So they still had the internal passports that had the ethnicity line, but you could put down whatever you wanted. So I went to get my new passport, and I said, I would like to put down as my ethnicity, citizen of Russia. And the lady behind the desk looked at my documents and said, wait, your mother was Jewish, your father is Jewish, what kind of citizen of Russia are you? And that, now I carry a passport with an X gender marker on it. And I go to a hearing in federal district court in Boston as a journalist to listen to the representative of the government basically make the same argument that it just has to say the thing that we say it has to say because we view it as a self-evident truth that there is a biological immutable characteristic that is essential to classifying all people. Right? So it's both this idea of biological essentialism and the idea that you absolutely have to have it as a part of your documented identity at all times, which, by the way, US passports did not have a gender or sex marker on them until 1976. And somehow people managed to travel and be identified.
I think we entered the last century without passports at all.
Correct.
Just a reminder. Hello, dear listeners, it's Laura. For 135 years, workers around the world have taken to the streets on May 1st to stand up against exploitation and fight for fair treatment and justice. In that spirit, we continue to dedicate ourselves to reporting on resistance, especially to fascism. We've hit the road running, reporting first and early on Bernie Sanders' Fighting Oligarchy tour, and in our report from Selma on the African-American experience of fascism in the USA. We're committed to following the story and going where the important action and wisdom is, but we can't do it without your help, which is why we've launched the Laura Flanders and Friends Resistance Reporting Fund, and it's why we're asking our viewers and listeners like you to contribute to it. We are non-commercial and advertising free. We're beholden to no party or corporation. But that freedom comes at a price. If you're able to help us pay for the time and labor and concrete costs that are associated with real reporting, please do it. Make a one-time donation or make it monthly. And in so doing, you'll be helping to keep us on the air and free for all in these dangerous, difficult, important times. All the details are at lauraflanders.org/donate. Thanks for being part of our community. So we're now in the realm of talking about ideas and understanding and naming phenomena that we're seeing ahead of us. And that takes me to the attacks on education, which I think I've heard you, Jason, say recently. The attacks on DEI in the name of anti-Semitism are really being weaponized to stop the thinking about power at all. And I wanted you to elaborate on that, both aspects, both what's being weaponized here and why.
Yeah, so first of all, the DEI stuff is anti-Blackness. I mean, I think with LGBTQ and people of color, both of these phrases hide that the target is T in one case and the target is Black people.
I always think once we become an acronym, we're in trouble anyway.
Right. But it's a mechanism to target the attack on critical race theory. Didn't work as a general strategy because critical race theory is an academic discipline, and you can't really at all plausibly say that the whole federal government is critical race theory. The ideology of the federal government is critical race theory, as Christopher Rufo initially wanted to say. But every organization has a DEI office. And so since every organization has a DEI office, you can plausibly say that every organization is associated with DEI, and then use that as just an excuse to go after anything you want. So now with anti-Semitism, I'd like to quote Masha Gessen here. I don't know if you've read this piece, you two, but they call it an anti-Semitic attack on anti-Semitism. And so it is this administration is anti-Semitic, this regime is anti-Semitic. They're filled with Christian nationalists. Project Esther is meant to protect us because we can't protect ourselves. They're exploiting the stereotype, to paraphrase one of Gessen's pieces. They're exploiting the stereotype that we control the institutions. They're radically increasing anti-Semitism in this country by leaning into the stereotype that if you mess with Jews, your institution will be destroyed, you'll be fired. They're creating mass anti-Semitism. They're doing it deliberately. And then, of course, they're doing that old anti-Semitic trick of dividing good Jews from bad Jews, where bad Jews are people like me who are against Israel's genocide in Gaza, and good Jews are the ones who are for Israel's war crimes in Gaza. And so they erase the mainstream media. The legacy media has a lot of responsibility here along a lot of these dimensions. If you look at the New York Times op-ed page, for a decade, the New York Times op-ed page has been concern trolling about leftists on campus, just constantly, not recognizing that the war on woke is a calling card of the international far-right attack on democracy. So that was like the legacy media gave also last year with the misrepresentations of the protests, the erasures of the Jews for ceasefire, the large number of Jews on our campuses who were in the protests. So all of that is a structure of weaponization and exploitation of stereotypes, anti-Black stereotypes, anti-Semitic stereotypes, to destroy institutions.
Anything you would add to Jason's version of what you wrote, Masha?
I would add, that was an excellent rendition. There's some of Jason's ideas in there too, which I wholeheartedly agree with. I would add there's another anti-Semitic ploy, which is I decide who's Jewish. Right? When Trump said that Chuck Schumer is not Jewish, he is now Palestinian because he did something that Trump didn't like.
That's the good Jew, bad Jew. Right. I decide who's Jewish. They're not even Jewish. The bad Jews aren't even Jewish at all. Ich bestimme, wer Jude ist.
Well, this goes back. I mean, again, I was recently talking to professors all across the country who have been trying to sound an alarm about what's happening, who have been sounding an alarm about what's happening on their campus. And one of them described the resistance as a linked arm underground, which I really appreciate that phrase, and I think it's a good one. At the same time, Masha, I know that you've written that what actually needs to happen is universities need to be less underground. They need to come out more. They need to be more visible, less bureaucratic, less capitalist, less commodified. And you had a great example from Poland that I wanted you to talk about, if you wouldn't mind.
So I think that we have seen that universities, until Harvard was finally pushed so far into a corner that it had to start fighting back. It had to start using its vast resources in order to fight back, which is something that Harvard wasn't initially going to do, which is extraordinary. But until that happened, we saw that universities were very, very easy to bring to heel. And I think we know why. Because universities, even though Trump is targeting universities in part because they're independent centers of knowledge production and knowledge dissemination, that's not the way universities are run. And by that, I mean, they're not run as though that's their primary purpose. Their primary purpose, the way they're run is as though their primary purpose is to grow in the capitalist model. And growing means getting more applicants so they can accept a smaller percentage of them, which means growing their ratings, growing real estate, growing the endowment. And when an institution that is in that mindset confronts a threat, then the thing that it starts protecting is the endowment, and not the thing that it supposedly exists to do. My argument is basically, if universities want to have a university to go with their endowment in some future point, and not distant future point, right, in 5 or 10 years, then they need to radically change their model and start spending their endowments on producing and disseminating knowledge. This doesn't solve all problems. It doesn't solve the problem of science funding because federal science funding is so vast and is such an easily wielded tool in the hands of this administration that there's going to be a net and catastrophic net loss of knowledge production, especially in the sciences and the very expensive research. But if universities at least want to maintain themselves as independent thinking centers, then they need to do what they need to do. And the other thing that they need to try to do is build a movement, a popular movement that includes the people that they are serving. And for that, they have to stop serving their trustees and start serving people that they educate. The example that I used from Poland is, and actually I used an example from this country that I love, which is Bard College, where I used to teach, which basically has responded to every crisis in the last quarter century by just teaching more people. That's been its model. And it now has more degree candidates outside its campus, many times more than it has on campus, because they're running public high schools that grant an associate's degree in various cities around the country, because they have a prison project, because they have micro colleges. They're very inventive. And the example that I used of using universities as resistance is the example of Polish flying universities, and also the parallel university in Kosovo, where when the government in Serbia in the early 1990s cracked down on Albanian language education in Kosovo, Kosovo Albanians walked out of the state education system and started an underground education system that lasted a decade and that produced the current state of Kosovo, which is a deeply flawed but democratic state.
Well, thank you for that. I do want to come back to where we began, because as we're talking, I feel I have two people who have been declaring us to be living in a absolute situation of crisis, calling on people to act more quickly, more radically, and yet we're having a fairly calm conversation. And I guess I want to stir you both up just a little bit here. First, what do you call what we're living in? And does it matter what word we use? I've seen you use a variety of them, Masha. Mafia state, secret police state. And then secondly, okay, we get the problem. What do we do? I want to hear from both of you. But first with this definition, like, what do you think we are in as of right now? Jason.
So I don't think these different terms that Masha used are incompatible. If you look at the Frankfurt School discussions of fascism, they call it a mafia state. They say that the fascist leader is a mob boss. So what is amazing is we're getting quotes from the fascism literature in the popular press by people who haven't read the fascism literature and when they're describing what's going on. So, I don't want to give too much credit to Arendt. There's a lot of there's Césaire, there's a bunch of, we have to remember the anti-colonial literature on fascism, which Arendt belongs to as well. But Arendt talks about, competent officials being replaced everywhere by incompetent loyalists. So we're seeing where she talks about vulgar, the appeal of the vulgar fascist leader, getting the cultural elites to bow and scrape before them. So the fascist leader is the mafia boss. And we also, in my work, I try to respect the Black intellectual tradition that has always called the longstanding racial hierarchies of the United States, the police state, the racist police state we have, of fascism, a form of fascism. Let's not forget, as Angela Davis reminded us in the Tanner lectures at Yale last week, that Jena, Louisiana, where Muhammad Khalil is being held, is also the site, the prison in Jena, Louisiana. Jena, Louisiana is also the site where 6 Black teenagers, the Jena 6, were illegitimately accused of attempted murder in 2007, I believe, and incarcerated. So we have to keep in mind this difficulty of thinking the longstanding problems of the United States, which I think are appropriately called fascism, and this new problematic where a lot of that police state then gets expanded and weaponized against everyone. But I would call it a fascism.
And I'm sure Native Americans would go back even further and call what they went through a fascist experience. Masha, coming to you, I mean, A, does it matter exactly what we're calling this? And B, is your hair in fact on fire?
My hair is in fact on fire. And it matters. I'm a journalist. So for me, it matters in every particular piece what terminology I'm using for the point that I'm trying to make. I used the term mafia state when I was trying to explain how it's organized. Right? And the mafia state is a very useful model, both its 20th century iteration and the more recent iteration from Hungary and Russia, which makes it very clear what Trump is doing as he takes money and power away from people and then reapportions it to his friends. I've used fascism when I've thought it was necessary. I've used autocracy sort of as an umbrella term. I don't want somebody. I think we like the problem of meeting the bar for calling what we're living through fascism is a made-up problem. It's just a question of sometimes of whether I want the reader to stumble over the word fascism in the second paragraph of my piece, or I want them to get something else out of reading it.
So we're moving to what the heck do we do? I mean, I think we've addressed, that illusion that people have that it can't happen here. Jason, you've laid out very well. It has happened here over generations. There's the other illusion that we like to tell ourselves is that we have time, that we're not there yet. Whatever you call it, we're not quite there yet. I guess what I've heard in some of the pieces that each of you have shared is that this is the window in which action needs to happen. And that goes back to the Dr. King quote, is there is such a thing as being too late. The question is what? What needs to happen? Who wants to go first? Masha?
So, my experience of living under totalitarianism, which is pretty significant, is that you always look back on your life a year ago and sometimes a week ago and think, wow, a lot more was possible then than is possible now. Things are going to continue to be possible for a long time. But the window, so I don't know that I want to say that the window is now, but the window is getting smaller every day. As we've in less than 100 days, we have gone to the territory of unmarked cars, people in plain clothes, snatching people off the street. A couple of months ago, we knew that non-citizens or that people who were undocumented, which is a bad term, but people who don't have legal status in this country were in danger. We're so far past that now. And of course, it's going to expand to include naturalized citizens and other citizens. So we need to be doing the maximum amount possible at any given moment. Now is not the time to act underground. That's not where the resistance should be, because it is still possible to be above ground, especially if there are numbers above ground. But the bigger problem is that's still how, that's not what, right? And the what is there needs to be more to this movement than resisting fascism. In part, because it's not a terribly convincing slogan to a large part of the population, which has been living with some form of fascism from as long as it's known itself, right? And then it's not a very terribly convincing slogan to the part of the population that is not feeling the full effects of it either. So what we need is something else, an alternative vision. The problem with the last 8 years is that the Democrats, while Trump has proposed a revived empire, a return to an imaginary past, the Democrats have proposed the way things are now, which are deeply unsatisfying and horribly anxiety-provoking for a very large number of people. So we need a vision of a future that is more appealing than the imaginary past. I don't actually think it's that hard, but that needs to be the task.
In an upcoming episode, I speak with Astra Taylor and Naomi Klein about exactly this, where they say an alternative vision to the nihilistic one coming from the end times fascists, as she call it, needs to be countered by a life-affirming vision of staying here, of being here, of appreciating what's here and cultivating the good that's here. Jason, form, content, how do we resist?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, as too often is the case with Masha. You can't just say anti-fascism because, you need to get, that presupposes that, okay, we're going to, we're just going to return to the status quo. We need an alternative vision from which the fascism is entirely not anymore seen as an option. And so we need some kind of reconceptualization of society, so it's not just status quo versus mythic past. And it's going to require significant structural change. Now, I think that we have to, though, address this in a non-ideal theoretic way. So we're in non-ideal conditions. If you had to do reality over again, you wouldn't have Harvard and Yale. You wouldn't have Ivy League institutions. You'd have public universities that serve a large group of people. You wouldn't have but we have elite universities. And so given that we're in these non-ideal circumstances, we need those universities to, we need the things that are attacked, the prestige law firms, the elite universities, which shouldn't exist in an ideal society, but they do in fact exist, and they are being targeted. So we need, I think those institutions should play leadership roles at this moment. And they should feel an obligation to play leadership roles. Ultimately, we need a vision of society that doesn't feed the resentment that makes them such useful targets in the first place. But that's a long-term goal. In the short term, we see this not just here, but in India. In India, in the 2019 Citizenship Amendment Act protests, the elite universities were targets. And we see that again here. So what Harvard did, what these institutions that shouldn't exist in an ideal society should do, what Harvard has done is giving a lot of people hope. I'm seeing that among people who are not in universities at all. Friends of mine who are in the music industry, in a wide variety of areas, they see what, in these non-ideal circumstances where we have these problematic institutions, these institutions standing up to this is giving people hope. And so I think we need to reward these institutions. We should reimagine society so that we don't need these institutions. But now that we have them, we should encourage them to act like Harvard acted and pretend that they're doing it because they're anti-fascist
And opposition
heroes.
is pretty effective against autocrats, if you look at history. Actual opposition, done right, done quickly enough, done assertively enough. Do you have a favorite example, Masha, that you want to share?
My history is not writing about success stories.
I'm pushing you.
I'm going to cede to Jason.
Well, yes, go ahead, Jason. I mean, if you read...
Masha and I come from virtually exactly the same family.
Okay, too much to ask you to have any story of positivity. But I do believe that if we go back to the Philippines again, you hear from Maria and others about how actually concerted action, sort of punching at the bully early and effectively, can be pretty effective. Yeah.
Well, let me point out, we live in a country where the civil rights movement happened. So, the civil rights movement is a model of anti-fascist resistance. It's one of the only times fascism has been halted nonviolently. So that kind of concerted attempt to elicit empathy, to awaken a dominant majority, in this country's case, white people, to what was happening was essential. So we live in that country. We live in that place. Everywhere you go, people have heard of Martin Luther King. They've heard of the civil rights movement, and for a reason. So I think it's quite clear that we need something like that to happen.
And we live in a country that celebrates having invented itself and having basically said, we're going to create a society like no society that has ever existed before. That's a pretty great history to build on.
And as queer people, we have certainly lived change in our lifetime that I don't think is going back in any bottle. So I would, Masha, you disagree? You think we're going back in a bottle? I don't see us receding back into our closets, do you?
I don't know. Ask me in a couple of years.
All right, I'll come back to you if I know where to find you. I guess I'll end on journalism. I mean, Jason, you quipped that the role of good journalists against fascism, I think, is to get ourselves shot at dawn and thrown out of windows. But we get your point. Do you have advice for journalists, Masha, specifically in this moment? And I should say, for the nitpickers out there, your hair is not actually on fire. It was a metaphor. We're reporters. But you get what we're saying. Advice to journalists.
Advice to journalists. Well, I think we should be aware that we have an extraordinarily robust free press in this country. We're missing a lot of elements of it. We're missing local media, which is a disaster. We're way too conglomeratized But still, we have a newspaper that I happen to work for that that represents a broad range of views on a daily basis. And okay, it's a broad range of views. I challenge you to find a newspaper anywhere in the world that represents a broader range of views.
We're talking about the New York Times.
Yeah. We were talking about the New York Times.
We could probably debate the New York Times forever.
The spectrum if I could, but it's a damn wide spectrum with an incredibly wide reach. That's not going to last forever if we keep going down this path. So we need to be doing as much investigative journalism, transparent journalism, storytelling journalism, and opinion journalism as we can right now without delaying it for even a matter of months.
And not obeying in advance, as your friend Snyder says, Jason.
I'm glad we can end on a point of disagreement between Masha and what I saw happening with the legacy press, the New York Times op-ed page, of course, before you came on, Masha, is an incredible legitimizing of the narrative that the Trump administration jumped on. And it was clear to me there was like Koch funding of it. But starting in 2015, the New York Times op-ed page was a veritable fountain of propaganda against leftists on campus. It was like op-ed after op-ed. This was all the while Turning Points USA was founded on hunting. Turning Points USA was founded on hunting progressive professors on campus. As progressive professors on campus were constantly targeted by college fix, campus reform, Turning Points USA. I don't recall a single New York Times op-ed about that. Dozens and dozens and dozens of New York Times op-ed articles legitimizing the narrative that wokeism and leftists on campus were the greatest threat to democracy since, I don't know when, since McCarthyism. So what I see the media as having completely laid the path and legitimized the narrative that for authoritarianism. And I've been saying this since 2016. I had in 2016, I had a debate with John McWhorter about this when I was like, this attack on free speech on campus is legitimizing authoritarianism. And so I think the media is going to have a lot, and we saw it again last year, where it took months for the media, including the New York Times, to add that little phrase, and some Jews are in the encampments. So I see the media as having done a kind of very profound intellectual betrayal of us that laid the groundwork for authoritarianism.
I don't know if Masha wants to respond. I would simply say, I guess I've got to the point where after years of criticizing the lack of spectrum beyond kind of A to B at the New York Times, I've started to say, okay, David Brooks, if you're here with us, raising an alarm, great. I would like to charge a little entrance fee, but hey, not much that we can do about that. Masha, Jason, it's been really a pleasure having you both with us. And we have a question we ask all our guests at the end of every episode, and I'll ask you. If there's a future, which I believe there is, what do you think its story will be of what we did now? Looking forward, I don't know, 50, 100 years, which take your pick. Jason.
Whoa. Well, I think the story that I've been thinking about is this sort of betrayal, this sort of buying in, not recognizing that that many things were strategies, that anti-Semitism on campus was a strategy, that hysteria about leftists on campus was a strategy to destabilize democracy. And now, belatedly, but hopefully not too late, the people who were responsible for legitimizing that strategy are now, hopefully not too late, recognizing what they legitimized. And maybe now that there'll be more of a uniform recognition of the threat.
Masha?
Well, if there is a future, then it will have to be a reinvention of the American idea and a re-embrace of this idea of a democracy, a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual democracy that has plenty to offer all of its people. And I'm deliberately not using the word citizens. If that doesn't happen, then there's no story, because there will be nobody to tell a story. Because this is happening here in the most powerful, wealthiest country in the world.
Masha Gessen, Gessen Stanley, thank you so much for your work and for sharing so many of your thoughts here with us today.
Thank you.
That was very fun. The two of you are the calmest,
the
calmest
people
alarm sounders about fascism that I could find anywhere.
Thanks for taking the time to listen to the full conversation featuring Masha Gessen, opinion columnist for the New York Times and author of Surviving Autocracy, as well as a distinguished professor at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at the City University of New York, and also Gessen Stanley, author of Erasing History and How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. He's a professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. These audio exclusives are made possible thanks to our member supporters. Please join our members now by making a one-time donation or by making it monthly. All the information is at lauraflanders.org. And thanks again to all of our member supporters.